What's going on? Kyle Welcher here. We're filming with Tackle Warehouse today. We got some of the new Spro products in. You know, frog fishing has been an absolute craze for the past 10 or 12 years. And me personally, I leave that bait on the front deck anytime the water temp's over 52 degrees. And we're gonna show y'all today the new Spro Flapping Frog and the Bronzeye Blade 65. So we're about to hop in the boat and dive into exactly how I rig and the equipment I use and the situations where I throw these two new baits. So taking a closer look at the design of these two frogs, the first one I'm gonna show y'all is the Bronzeye Blade 65. This is the standard Bronzeye frog 65 that's been around forever, caught millions and millions of bass on it. This has got the same Gamakatsu 4/0 hooks. This thing has an awesome hookup ratio. Anytime that you're fishing a frog like this, a lot of people want to tweak the hooks and stuff like that. I only tweak the hooks on a popping frog. This frog right here goes from a very slender nose to the hooks. It doesn't have a lot of obstruction, whereas like a popping frog has a mouth on it. That's kind of an obstruction for the hooks. So I bend them on that. On this one, I do not. But the cool new addition to this frog is the blades on the back. It's just going to give that bait a little bit of a different presentation. So in the fall, whenever you're trying to mimic shad and using a white bait, or you know, if you're trying to mimic bluegill, you're going to use a gold one. You just want to kind of scale the colors and change it depending on the forage you're trying to use. But it's a really cool new option, you know, to kind of mimic those small shad in the fall. So really cool new product from Spro. The other one we're gonna check out is the Flapping Frog. This is one that you're gonna cover water with, but there's actually something really cool and really new about this frog. The hooks that are coming in the Flapping Frog are nano coated. So that means that whenever you're throwing this frog as far as you possibly can and trying to get a good hookup ratio, it's gonna have that super slick coating to really penetrate from a long distance. It's got the body style of the original Bronzeye Frog 65, but it's made out of a different material that's extremely elastic and very, very stretchy, so it's gonna last a long time, but it's also gonna be extremely soft. So just like I said, on a super long cast, whenever that bait's a long way away, it's gonna compress extremely easily and you're gonna get those 4/0 Gamakatsu hooks in the bait. So another cool thing about this frog is it does float in place. So you're gonna be able to stop it, pause it, and it has a really good gurgling action. So it's a really exciting bait, and with a proven body that's gonna have a really good hookup ratio. So a really cool new bait. So I love throwing a frog. So I throw a frog even whenever it's colder than most people would. I've caught some really big ones on a frog in water as cold as 46, but it's not till about 52 degrees where I think it's actually one of the best baits to throw in a given scenario. So the first frog that I'm gonna pick up coming into the pre-spawn is I'm gonna pick up a frog that I can walk in place and keep it there, you know, for a long period of time. So whenever the fish are moving up pre-spawn, I really want to, you know, fish the clumps of grass and stuff extremely slow. So I'm gonna pick up a frog like the Bronzeye Blade 65 where I can keep that bait in place for a long time and really entice those big females that have moved up. I'm gonna throw this primarily under the backs of shallow docks, over the tops of extremely shallow laydowns, stumps, anything like that where I want the bait to stay in place for a long period of time. And if I feel like there's been a warming trend and the fish are really pulling up and getting extremely aggressive in the pre-spawn like they always do whenever they're feeding up for the spawn, I'll pick up a frog like the new Flapping Frog and I can cover water with it. I can run down seawalls, shade lines, any kind of a rock transition I can catch them off of. I can throw it by the same clumps of grass or skip it under the same, you know, walkways of docks or whatever it is that I want to do. But it just helps me cover water a little bit faster if I feel like those fish are extremely aggressive in the pre-spawn. So a frog can be a really good bait when the bass are spawning to kind of draw those fish away from the cover and kind of draw them off of the beds and kind of show themselves. But you're going to have to come back with a different bait typically and catch them. I really pick the frogs up again in the post-spawn whenever the bass start feeding up on bait again. You know, all the fish in the lake are shallow whenever they're spawning, and then immediate post spawn is one of the best times to catch them on a frog. And right after the bass come off bed, you've got shad spawn starting, you've got the brim starting to bed, and it's really easy to stay around the bait even before the grass gets super matted up like it does in late summer. So I'll, you know, use these two frogs kind of in the same situation. If I'm skipping under overhangs and stuff like that where I feel like there's a big concentration of fish, I'm usually going to pick up a frog like the Bronzeye Blade 65 and I'm going to walk it in place a little bit more. But if I'm on, you know, the inside edge of grass, or if the shad are spawning on a seawall or floating docks or something like that, I'm going to pick up something like the Flapping Frog. Same thing if I'm fishing brim beds. I'm gonna throw this bait right here over the tops of brim beds, and I'm gonna take the Bronzeye Blade 65 and kind of skip that around the overhangs and the undercuts close to the brim beds where the fish might be hanging out. And then obviously in summer, that's whenever everybody else throws a frog, everybody throws a frog around grass and all that types of stuff. I do that also. And if I'm around, you know, the thick, sloppy vegetation, I'm usually gonna pick up the bigger style frog, you know, and go a little bit slower on the edge of grass, but at the same time, everybody has been out there and seen them blowing up on bait on the edge of grass, or in the morning you're trying to cover a lot of water, I'm going to use the flapping frog on the outside edge of grass or the inside edge of grass and try to cover as much water as I possibly can. So that's the two different scenarios where I pick up one. It just depends on how much water I'm trying to cover in a short amount of time. I really feel like if you can put it in front of one, you're going to get more bites on the bronze-eye blade, but you can put it in front of a lot more bass a lot faster using the flapping frog in the summertime. So the fall can be some of the absolute best frog fishing of the year. A lot of the lakes, especially in the south where I'm from, they get a lot of grass in them. They get hydrilla, milfoil, and it mats up a lot in late summer. What happens whenever it mats up is a lot of the grass underneath it actually dies, so there'll be big holes in the grass, and that's going to be the sweet spot where you really want to slow down and fish something like the Spro Bronze-Eye Blade 65. I mean, it is like, that's what you want to do. You want to find the holes in the grass underneath those mats and just milk it as slow as you possibly can. But another thing they notoriously do in the fall is they chase bait on the outside edge of grass. So that's whenever you want to throw the flapping frog. You can cover a ton of water. I mean, you can throw it a mile and you can find those fish that are busting and you can really make them react to it. Another cool thing is this bait will float. So whenever they miss it, you can really stop it and pause it and leave it in place. But those shad and stuff the fish are eating in the fall are really, really small. All the bait just seems to be a little bit small going into late summer and you know, early fall especially. So you always have to keep a follow-up bait because they're gonna miss the bait relatively often. I kind of skew this, the heaviness of the weight that I have on my follow-up bait depending on how thick the cover is. I'm fishing a lot of lay downs or like thick grass or stuff. I'll have a little bit heavier weight, but the best bait that I found for a follow-up bait is a Missile Baits quiver. I usually keep it on a 1/4 ounce weight and I flip it around anytime they miss the frog. It doesn't matter if I'm on a seawall or in heavy grass. I'll flip it in there and usually before it gets to the bottom, they're swimming off with it. You know, and actually the fall doesn't have to be all about the grass. It's really more about finding the bait. And in frog fishing in general, it doesn't have to be all about the grass. So even in the fall on a lot of the lakes that I fish don't have a lot of grass. So I'll get up there and anywhere, channel swing banks or anywhere that I feel like bass are waiting to ambush on bait, that's where I'm gonna throw the frog, and if they miss it, I'm still gonna throw the follow-up bait. So shallow laydowns, anything that's, you know, back posted docks, anything that's close to a channel swing where the shad are migrating, I'm gonna throw a frog over it, grass or not. All right, so we went over the technical aspects of it. I showed y'all everything that I do for frog fishing. Now it's time to get out on the water and show y'all how I fish it. So this is the exact scenario where I would really want to pick up the bronze-eye frog typically, but the cool thing about the new bronze-eye blade is it actually has a very unique sound coming back where you can hear the blades on the bottom actually clinking together. And every single bite I've had on this bait so far, I could hear the blades clinking, and then the fish would come up and get it. So you just throw it in the thickest, heaviest cover, and now I'm actually making a lot shorter twitches and working it a little bit faster than I normally would to try to get them blades to move a little bit more. So it's just a very unique profile. It's a lot different than the standard thing. So a very highly pressured fishery. This is going to be just something unique that might get you a few more bites. So this right here is that new Spro flapping frog. This is how I like to fish it. This is a perfect scenario. This is a little bit of a creek mouth where there's more isolated grass. It's got long shade lines, it's got docks, it's got some wood out in the middle. So it's got a lot of different places where, you know, the strike zone could be really, really long here. So this is the kind of bait that you are going to want to pick up so you can really cover it all extremely efficiently, and you're not going to have to, you know, leave it in place for too long. But it is a cool deal with it though, because you can pause it on the edge of those isolated grass mats. You can pause it if you see a fish, you know, wake under it. You can slow down a lot. So that's exactly why I'm going to pick up the flapping frog though, so I can cover all this water efficiently, not get hung up at all, and draw fish from, you know, 20 yards of the cast. I'll have a good chance of getting a bite. So another really, really good way to use this flapping frog is skipping it under like shallow docks, shallow pontoon boats. I know that if a bass is under there, he's gonna see my bait, and I can cover the entire pontoon boat in just like a couple of seconds and make sure that I showed a presentation to a fish that I believe he'll bite. You know, this is a little bit heavier of a bait. You know, a lot of people skip worms around, stuff like that. This bait's a little bit heavier. You really wanna let the rod work for you. It really is gonna load and then let that rod propel this bait under there. It's a super soft bait. It'll skip really, really good as long as you don't try to overpower it. You just kinda wanna load the rod up, flick the wrist, and skip it on under there. So this right here is the Missile Baits quiver. This is one of my favorite follow-up baits. You know, anytime that I'm fishing a frog around cover, I want to put a worm with a little bit of weight on it, just so if one does blow up on this bait, you know, right on the edge of the pads, I can actually get this bait to go in there and, you know, penetrate, actually put it in front of the fish. But it's also a bait that I find myself picking up a ton. Every time I'm going down the bank and I just pass a dock that's a little bit deeper, or a lay down, or a tree, or anything that's isolated patch of grass a little bit deeper off the bank that's, you know, a little bit too deep that I think that might not come up on the frog, I'll pitch this bait around also. So it's a really good follow-up bait, but it's just a bait you got to leave on the front deck, and you can help you cover water a little more efficiently. So whenever I do pick up this quiver worm, I fish it two different ways. If I'm gonna pitch it to the isolated cover that's a little bit deeper, I will put it in there and drag it by it, you know, extremely slow. But if I had a fish that came up and blew up on a frog, I already know that fish is aggressive. I'm gonna pitch that bait in there, let it go to the bottom. I might hop it one time, and I'm gonna instantly, you know, reel it out and try to make another cast to a different place, because I know that fish is aggressive. I know if he sees the bait and wants to bite, he's gonna bite it. So if I'm gonna go slow, I'm gonna go slow on the little bit deeper stuff. Okay, so one thing that I do a little bit different than most people is I always try to, you know, skew the rod and the reel and the line that I'm using to how hard it is to actually penetrate the hook. So whenever I'm using this bronze-eye blade, it has a really big Gamakatsu 4/0 hook. It's got a big barb on it. So I want to upsize my rod all the time to make sure that I get that hook in past the barb. Because I mean, you could set the hook on a fish, get that hook in past the barb, and pretty much give him slack, and he can't come off if you get that hook in right. So I use a 7'6". If you're going to frog fish, you need to use at least a 7'3" to a 7'6". I like to have a little bit extra length so that I have more of the rod loaded whenever that fish is running back at me as fast as he possibly can. It's going to be harder for that fish to get slack in the rod or in the line. And then whenever I'm fishing, you know, big grass mats or in bushes or anything, I can move that fish a long way. I have a lot of power and a lot of length and a lot of leverage to really move that fish and get him exactly where I want to get him, so I have a better chance of landing that fish. I work this frog using the rod. So anytime I'm doing that, I use an 8-to-1 gear ratio reel, because I'm imparting all the action with the rod. All I'm doing is reeling up slack with the reel until I set the hook on a fish. So I like to have it as fast as possible. This is 8-to-1 gear ratio, and I use 50-pound braid. I think that's the minimum I would use for throwing this big frog, because you're trying to throw it in the heaviest cover you possibly can and get that fish out. You don't want to have any worries at all. This right here is the Sunline SX1. I always use at least 50-pound test, just so I have no hiccups at all. So another thing that I do is I do kind of tweak exactly which braid I'm using for every single technique. If I'm going to be skipping a ton, you know, if I think I'm going to be skipping a ton, I'm going to use the Sunline SX1. The braid, just whenever it's brand new, is a little bit softer. It seems to come off the reel a little bit smoother and seems to be a better braid for skipping. But if I want something that's an absolute powerhouse, or if I'm just, you know, going to be doing, you know, any kind of regular cast, I feel like the strongest braid out there is the Sunline X Plasma. So if I'm just, you know, doing regular casts, not a ton of skips, I really like the X Plasma for that. I don't think it can be broke. A couple of the cool things that I mentioned about the flapping frog, make it, you know, where you have the ability to throw a little bit shorter of a rod. This frog has an extremely soft body, and it's got the nano coated hooks. So if you're making a really long cast with it, you can get away with a 7'3" heavy, and that's what I like to do, because the rod's a little bit lighter, a little bit easier to fish with all day. I can still get that hook in using this 7'3" heavy. So I would recommend this. I think this is the perfect size rod for this. I do downsize or go a little bit slower with my gear ratio on this one, because I am imparting the action using the reel on this one. So I do go down to a 7-to-1. And this is 50-pound Sunline X Plasma braid. So that's kind of the way that I skew things for the frogs. If I can get away with it and I think I can get that hook penetrated, I will go down to a rod that's a little bit lighter and more comfortable to fish with. And you're never going to have a day where every fish that bites, you know, gets your frog. So I keep a follow-up bait laid on the deck of the boat, and this is a Missile Baits quiver. This is the 6.5-inch version of it. It's got a 3/0 straight shank Gamakatsu hook, and I keep a 1/4 ounce weight, you know, as my standard setup. I really like this worm because whenever it's falling, it does have a tail that's very unique. So in pressured fish, a lot of times that's why they don't get the frog. I like to have something that's a little bit different, a little bit unique. I think I have found the dream setup for pitching this worm around. It's a 7'3" medium heavy, 20-pound Sunline shooter, and an 8-to-1 gear ratio reel. I pitch this in everything and I have no problem getting them out, but it's a very necessary piece of equipment for trying to land those bass. And I also just kind of, you know, pick which color quiver I want to use based on visibility in the water. I don't think color's super important. I just want to make sure when I pitch it in there, the bass can see it. So that's my frog fishing setups. So these two frogs are just a couple of the frogs that Spro actually have to offer. You know, like I said, frog fishing is not just a summertime deal. You can catch them all year round, and now Spro has a frog for every single application. You can throw a frog all year round in every different scenario. So put some of these tips to good use, try some of the new frogs, and then try some of the old ones as well that have been catching fish for years and years and years and still have some great applications. So all these products I mentioned today are listed below. You know, if you have any kind of a video or ideas or anything that you want to see, let us know in the comments. If you like this video, leave a like. If you got some buddies that like frog fishing, share it with them. If you want to see more of me, my channel is Kyle Welcher on YouTube. So it's been a, you know, really fun topic to talk about for a long time. I absolutely love throwing frogs, but we'll see you on the next video.